How do you turn your skill at empathy into a robust business tool for designing and refining value propositions? It's part of the Austrian recipe for business success.
This is the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast. Entrepreneurs are champions for customers, improving their lives with preferred products and services, value, and innovation. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one by building a beautiful business. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Value is at the center of the Austrian business model. As we always emphasize, value is an experience of the customer. Businesses aim to facilitate a great customer experience and thereby facilitate value. Experience is not perfectly definable or measurable. It's subjective. So what is the best way for businesses to facilitate an outcome that they can't define and they can't measure? Well, there's a tool for that, and it goes by the name of empathy. Empathy is not what you may think. You may have thought of it as relating to sentiment and interpersonal emoting. But for entrepreneurs, it's a robust business tool. It's a critical component in the process of business building and value realization. The key to empathy as a business tool is the concept of empathy as a process. Austrian economics analyzes all markets as processes. They're always in motion, always changing, businesses and customers interacting, complex networks and their interconnected nodes in continuous flux and rearrangement. Part of this dynamic is the mind of the customer, always receiving and processing information, always formulating and reformulating preferences, always projecting expectations into the future and having them fulfilled or disappointed and reacting accordingly. The entrepreneur seeking to serve this customer needs a tool to isolate the specific customer experience with which the business is concerned and to slow down that kaleidic whirl of experience into some discrete time periods to analyze. What's the customer feeling now? And how might they feel in the near future after learning about a new value proposition the entrepreneur makes? As we continue to build our Economics for Business toolkit, we wanted an empathy tool to help entrepreneurs to do exactly that, project how customers feel and will feel in the future about their value propositions. The conversation you're about to hear will provide the in-depth understanding needed for tool design and implementation. I'll be talking to Mark Packard, the author of Value Learning Process that has already proven so useful for so many businesses, and one that will become even more useful to more people when we release the online course Mark recently recorded for the Economics for Business platform. Mark teaches entrepreneurship at the University of Nevada, Reno, and is also a business consultant and co-founder of Praxio Venture Consulting, and most importantly to us, is a core member of the Mises Institute Economics for Business project. Mark, welcome to Economics for Entrepreneurs again.
Hey, Hunter, good to be back.
Well, it's really good to have you. You've become a prestige guest because we've had several business leaders, CEOs, partners in professional services firms, marketing VPs, and others contact me about the podcast that we recorded and the associated model that you introduced as the value learning process. And people have been applying it directly to their business, asking new questions, creating new improvements, and it's helped them, it's helped their business. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, yeah, that's great to hear. That's awesome.
It is. And we're always developing new applications. I think you called that one Value as a Process. And today we're going to talk about another one of your innovations in theory that can be directly applied for listening entrepreneurs. And let's call this one Empathy as a Process. So we're always talking about the importance of empathy, but you've developed it a little bit further in your research, and you continue to do so. Let's start at recapping the role that empathy plays for entrepreneurs. And you also mentioned in your recent paper that sometimes empathy theories aren't entirely apt for entrepreneurship. So tell us the role that it should play, and tell us the way that some theorists have got it wrong, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. So first, so why empathy matters for entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurship is a classic case of what we call epistemic interdependence, and by that uh, we mean it's basically a fancy way of saying that the success of my action or the entrepreneur's action depends on what someone else will do, what others will do. In the case of entrepreneurship, that's consumers, right? So entrepreneurs don't actually have control of their own destiny. You know, you hear that sometimes, pitched as a soundbite by thought leaders in the entrepreneurial community. But as Mises explains, entrepreneurs are servants to the consumer, which is the principle of consumer sovereignty that I know you're familiar with.
Mhm.
So, so in order for entrepreneurs to succeed, they have to convince others to side with them, right? Unless you're the government, you don't have the ability to coerce consumers to buy your stuff. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, in general, we generally say that that you have two options. One, you can listen to what your customers say, um, what they say they want, and learn how to do that for them. Or two, you can persuade them to want what you already have or do. But I think that's not exactly right, and this gets back to that customer value learning cycle that we talked about in previous episodes. Customers don't know what to want, right? They're learning what to want over time. They of course they do want certain things at this specific moment in time, but they're in this learning process. And so if you ask them what they want, all they can really tell you is what they've already figured out that they want right now, which is usually something that already exists. And if you can provide that value to them better than what exists on the market already, then great, you've got a decent shot at success. But you're also in danger of disruption because you're not at values cutting edge. You're kind of at this a position in the market where um it you're you're developing and putting forth, you're proposing established and familiar value, but you're not changing or advancing the ball. And so if someone else comes in and does that, you're in danger of disruption. So new theorizing on entrepreneurship suggests that to find those ideas that actually disrupt a market, um, those those ideas that the consumers didn't know they wanted before you came up with, right? This is kind of the Steve Jobs um, theory or idea that customers don't know what they want until you show it to them. To
Mhm.
to find those types of ideas, you have to have empathy. And so, one way to, I guess, the way I've been thinking about it in this research project is that, in general, a lot of times, and this goes to another project that I just published in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. Consumers do a lot of things for themselves, right? We make our own lunches, and we bathe ourselves and brush our own teeth. And so a lot of the value that we have through and create throughout the day, we create for ourselves. But when we're talking about these bigger, more complex value satisfactions, most consumers don't have the technological wherewithal to actually create solutions to a lot of their problems, and so they turn to other people to do that for them. And we kind of talked about this before, I think, also, but the people that have the technological wherewithal don't necessarily have the understanding of the consumer problem, the needs knowledge, as I call it, that so that they can really solve the problem that consumers are experiencing effectively. Um, so if you are a technologist and it's not your own need that you're trying to solve, then the only way to get that needs knowledge is through some type of empathy experience, through some type of empathy. Do you want to get into the philosophy of knowledge that kind of underpins this paper and these ideas?
Yeah, let's touch on it a little bit. No, that's always valuable to everybody. Let me ask you one question just before we go there, though, Mark. The idea that consumers um, can't tell you what they want specifically in the future, the Steve Jobs problem, they don't know it until they see it. I get that, but one of the elements in human action and other theories of entrepreneurship is that they can express dissatisfaction. And I translate that as I'm sure there's something better in the future. I may not know what it is, but I want that. I'm seeking that betterment. Is that an accurate component?
Yeah, more or less. When we're as consumers in this value learning cycle, what we have as information is kind of the feelings of our we say dissatisfaction, but what we mean by that is an unmet need, and what Mises called an uneasiness that accompanies that unmet need, right? And so we're feeling uneasy, and we're trying to figure out what's causing that uneasiness. And unfortunately, there our bodies are pretty marvelous mechanisms to kind of help us with our sensory system to pinpoint more or less generally what's going on. In some ways, like if my tummy's grumbling, I can pretty quickly realize that I'm hungry and I need to eat something. But a lot of our dissatisfactions, our uneasiness, are far more complex and convoluted and hard to kind of unpack. And so customers, consumers are trying to kind of unravel what the causes of those uneasiness experiences are, and by doing that, they can figure out what satisfactions are better than what exists now. And as an entrepreneur, you have to do the same thing. You have to understand that uneasiness experience very well if you're going to be able to figure out how to solve it in a way better than what exists already. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. I diverted you a little bit, but I do have this feeling that the customer has um, more to contribute sometimes than we uh, we sometimes appear to say in the kind of images we draw. But let's get back to where you were. So give us a little bit on the philosophy of knowledge,
Well,
because that'll be helpful.
yeah, and this is kind of to your point just there, that consumers do have a lot, and that learning experience. That's their whole goal, is to learn this thing. But the problem is that this type of knowledge, this uneasiness experience, it's experiential knowledge, which is what we call tacit. So the idea of tacit knowledge comes from work by Michael Polanyi, and basically explains that there's two types of knowledge: explicit versus tacit. And explicit knowledge is basically factual knowledge. It's information. It's communicable um, information about whatever can be communicated, things that characteristics and stuff. To be able to communicate these things, you have to have some kind of shared understanding of concepts, right? We have to have an understanding of what colors are and what color red is, for me to tell you that Santa's suit is red, and for me to understand that. But explicit knowledge can be communicated. But there's another type of knowledge that can't be communicated, and this is experiential knowledge, right? So maybe the best example of this that I've ever heard, and credit to Boyd K. Packard, that pitched the idea, or gave the example, is the question of the idea of explaining the taste of salt. So assume that I've never tasted salt before.
Mhm.
I've never had that experience. I grew up in some kind of weird isolated community that doesn't have salt. Can you tell me what salt tastes like?
Yeah, I've been struggling with that. It tastes salty. That's the best I can do.
Right? That doesn't help me much, right? This is a classic case of tacit knowledge. You know what salt tastes like because you've experienced it, and you can tell someone else talk to someone else that's experienced salt and tasted it. You can talk about something being salty with someone else that knows salt, but it's an experience that you have to have for yourself if you're going to understand it, right?
Mhm. Yep.
And the case of riding a bike is another one. No matter how much information you pound into your kid's head, they're never gonna know how to ride a bike until they do it for themselves.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4EPod. That's MISES.org/E4EPOD and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
And that's why you call it experiential knowledge, right? You've got to experience it.
Yes. And so customers' uneasiness is experiential knowledge.
Yeah.
They can't really tell you exactly what's going on. And I mean, they could kind of give you the explicit pieces of that knowledge, of that understanding, right? What's going on and what's happening around and all the context and stuff, but you can't know what it's really like for them because it's experiential knowledge. And so this is why empathy matters, because empathy is the only real way to get that experiential knowledge. And then to your second point, or your second part of that question, why haven't we really gotten empathy right yet in the entrepreneurship literature? Is well, some entrepreneurship scholars say that we need empathy to understand consumers' needs. They've already kind of explained this, and that more accurate empathy leads to better results. But that's basically as far as we've gotten. We haven't really dug into what empathy really is. And so I started digging into this a few years ago. Back in my PhD days is when I really started getting interested in this. And I realized, I found in my review of empathy that empathy scholars are all over the place. They don't even agree on what empathy is. There's so many different definitions. And so in social psychology, which is kind of the bulk of empathy research, that most scholars have come to understand empathy to be some kind of instinctive emotional response where the empathizer's emotions come to mimic or match the emotions of the person being empathized with. Now, this, of course, doesn't work for entrepreneurship theory, because entrepreneurs are after that needs knowledge, right? That experiential knowledge of that uneasiness that needs experience, right? It's not enough to just feel someone else's emotions, because there could be any number of reasons why they're feeling that way. So what we're after is understanding that experiential knowledge, that deep tacit understanding of that uneasiness experience. So our empathy concept for entrepreneurship, at least, has to be able to capture that tacit learning. And so that was the motivation of this paper.
Good. So empathic accuracy, we've used that term on the podcast, but maybe that's not right. You can't be accurate with something that's attempting to identify somebody else's experience. Accuracy doesn't sound like the right word.
Well, I mean, yes and no. You can't say it's perfectly accurate, because that's never the case, right? You can't perfectly empathize, because your experience or your understanding of someone else's experience can never perfectly match what someone else themselves have experienced. Or at least, even if that was possible, we could never know because of this tacit barrier. And so, but but at the same time, you can have more accurate empathy. You can be closer to understanding their experience as they experienced it than, some maybe, just like stereotyping what they what they probably think or something like that.
Yeah. Well, that's useful because that suggests that some entrepreneurs can be better at it, or at least if you practice and work hard at it, you can get better. So
Yes,
that's encouraging.
it can be learned and bettered for sure.
Yeah, good. So let's move on in your paper to your, uh, I want to call it redefinition of the concept. Maybe it's not a redefinition, but tell us what you've developed in the paper, because we're certainly definitely moving in the way of a tool, something that can be used and learned, as you said. So take us through that.
Yeah, it's not my definition. I didn't have to redefine it myself, fortunately. But the thing is, yeah, in social psychology, they've really kind of gotten it wrong so far, at least as far as a useful construct for entrepreneurship theory. But as I was doing further research, I found that there's actually a branch in philosophy where some philosophers have been doing work on what empathy is really. And so I came across this work, and they've actually done some pretty good work on this. They haven't really like built theory of how this works, but they came up with some really good and important insights on what empathy really is. And I use Amy Copland's definition. She's a philosopher she's in California somewhere, at least last I saw. And her definition is very complex and very specific, but it's also very precise and accurate. And I won't give you the full definition, formal definition, but we can just say that her definition is basically a form of vicarious imagination where the empathizer mentally simulates someone else's experience to see what it's like. Um, so vicarious imagination just means imagining someone else's experience, right? So um, one way to do that, and the more accurate way to do that, is through a mental simulation process, which is basically how we play things out in our minds. In this case, it would be someone else's experience. We'd play that other person's experience out in our mind to imaginatively simulate what it would be like. But here's a key insight. It's not this is not perspective taking. I'm not trying to walk in someone else's shoes, right? It's not about seeing what another's experience would be like if you were that person. It doesn't necessarily matter what you would feel like in that situation for entrepreneurship. What really matters is what the consumer feels in their own shoes, right? What they are feeling themselves. And so that's really what the target of empathy is. We're trying to understand what they feel like when they experience their own needs, and not what you would feel like if you were in their situation. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah, it does. And I like to pick up on that term simulation, because uh, we can understand that a little bit. I think you think of simulation of games like Madden NFL football. I can't feel what Tom Brady feels when he throws the ball, but I can simulate what happens when he throws the ball. Which uh, it's a close concept. I'm not saying it's the same as you're saying, but simulation is something we can build tools for simulation. We can map processes for simulation. So I'm picking up on simulation.
Yeah. To maybe elaborate a little bit on this, we really simulate everything. So this goes into kind of a philosophical perspective that we call representationalism, which is the prevailing view in philosophy, which is that we don't experience reality directly. When we see something, it's just a kind of an image that our optic nerve captures and sends a signal to our brains. But what happens in our brain is our minds take these signals and they simulate an image or an experience of what's going on. And so it's that simulation, that internal mental simulation, that is what we actually see or experience. But we do this same process for when we remember things, when we reminisce about a past experience, right? So if you think of some of your favorite experiences in the past, you can like relive them in your mind. This is a mental simulation process.
Mhm.
And the same thing with when you're making expectations, when we're predicting what things will be like. We can pre-live things. We can think, if I'm going to go to Disneyland for Christmas, for example, I can imagine what that will be like in my mind, and that is a simulation process. And so empathy is the same thing. We are kind of living a mental experience without actually physically doing it, and experiencing it imaginatively in that way.
Okay, I've got the process model of the empathy simulation in front of me from your paper, and we'll link to that, or we'll publish it on the notes for this podcast so people can see it and think their way through it. But take us through a little bit. You said running a script through this empathic model, through this mental model, using the two kinds of knowledge. Let's get into the specifics of that and see if you can talk us through running the script through the model.
Okay, yeah. So when we're doing a mental simulation, what's really working in your mind is that you're basically taking your inputs. Wait, I mentioned when you're just kind of experiencing something, when you're seeing something, you take your optic nerve signals as your inputs, and maybe some other sensory inputs also. But when you're doing a kind of a more of an imaginative simulation, you're taking some kind of script as your input to this mental simulation process, and it runs through what we call your mental model of reality. And this mental model is basically your knowledge and understanding of the world and how it works. So you input these signals or this script into the model. You play it out causally in your mind to what would happen and how it would happen into some kind of outputted simulated experience. And so the mental model is comprised of your worldview, your past experiential knowledge that you've kind of gained throughout your life and built over time, as you try to make sense of all the experiences you've had in the past. And the input to it, the script, as you said, that you play through that mental model is what you know about the experience. So in this case, we're talking about the consumer's experience, right? So this is all the information you can collect about what the consumer has experienced and how they've experienced it, right? So we talk about context. We would want to know, you know, what the events were that happened and how they happened, and to what extent we can know it, why they happened. And all of this stuff you can get from your customers. You can go to your customers and ask them all these pieces of information, right? But then once we have all this information, we have our script of what happened, the experience. Then we have to empathize. We have to play that out in our minds and mentally simulate it so we can experience that same experience for ourselves. But again, what we want is how our customers experienced it. That's our ultimate goal. But of course, we don't have their own experiential mental model. We only really have our own. So, we run into this tacit barrier. You only get to use your own experience for this, but you can do a few things to try to improve this.
Let me ask you a question at this point, Mark. It's making me think that as an entrepreneur, I have to have some closeness or familiarity with the customer's experience. What's in my head is I enjoy driving cars. I could become a car designer and think about a future car driving experience for a customer. But I don't think I could be a dress designer because I never worn a dress and I can't figure out that experience. Is that Is that right? Did entrepreneurs have to have some kind of experiential closeness or parallels, or is it all entirely projectable?
Yeah, you've got it mostly right. Yeah, so this is exactly one of the primary reasons why user entrepreneurs tend to be more successful on average than non-user entrepreneurs, and this is the work of Eric von Hippel and some others. But the reason why user entrepreneurs are more successful is because they're solving their own needs, right? And so they don't really have to go through the empathy process to get to a solution that works for them, right? Because they're solving their own needs. But then they still have to empathize to go from that solution for themselves into a projection of this solution will work for other people. Because you have to expect and empathically perceive that other people experience the same need in the same way that you do. But it is also true that um, if I kind of have the same or similar experiences to other people, a similar background and passions and interests, then I'm going to be able to empathize better with those people, right? The similarity of your past experience, if with other people, facilitates empathy. As if you have similar life experiences, similar cultural backgrounds, similar interests, then you will be able to understand each other better.
Yeah, that's helpful. It's a guide, right? It's a check that an entrepreneur could make. Hey, am I legitimately running this mental model? Do I really have the knowledge about the experience from myself that I can legitimately project to the customer's experience? I get that. So let's go the next step, which you mentioned. You use this word predictive in the paper, that there's the possibility of predictive experiential knowledge. So presumably that's when you've broken through, you've got a good prediction of what the customer is going to feel like in the future.
Right. That's a really important point, because for the entrepreneur, it's ultimately not about what a consumer's experience was like, although that's important to know, but you need to figure out what their experience will be like when they consume your product. That's that's really what matters for you, the entrepreneur. You're predicting their satisfaction experience from your own productive efforts, what you plan to do for them. So this effort is necessary to see what you can do to improve their experience and how much value you can facilitate for them. But you can only determine this if you understand first what their experience is like now, and second, why their current experience is as it is, and then third, what can be done to change that experience for the better.
Yeah, which also introduces the concept of time, right? This future experience, which we're trying to predict today.
Yeah, and introduces a lot of uncertainty
Yeah,
too.
exactly. So we'll go into that another time. I've just been reading about the role of time in opportunity, but let's go there anyway. So we've got a predicted experience that can become an identified economic opportunity for the entrepreneur. So tell us about that, because there's a lot of controversy about the word opportunity, I understand, but take us through how you think about that.
Yeah, so I think in my original version of this paper, we skirted the term opportunity, just because I agree with Peter Klein generally that the term opportunity is laden with misunderstanding, and the objectivists, the empiricists, that they kind of misuse it. And so I use it like the Austrian subjectivists do, as a metaphor for some imagined situation where you can plausibly make some consumers better off through your economic production and through exchange, for a profit. So this it's not out there waiting to be discovered. It's something that you imaginatively create or presume, but it's not really kind of out there. But to see such a situation where you can plausibly improve, create, facilitate I like to use the word facilitate for value. So a situation where you can facilitate value, more value for customers than what exists on the market now, you have to use some kind of empathic imagination. You have to predict what consumers will value and how and why. And so this is where we kind of dovetail into a second point that I think is really important, and that's that empathy is not really enough. You can't just empathize and then say, aha, now I know, now I have an opportunity, because empathy is just the experience, that imaginative mental simulation of what another person is experiencing themselves. But you have to infer from that some conclusions, some knowledge of what is going on and why it's happening, so that you can kind of figure out kind of the causal connections that'll allow you to create a better solution. If you understand why that experience is happening the way it's happening, there's a good chance you can devise some solution that is better than what exists now. So we go into what we call inferential accuracy as a secondary step. You have to be able to infer correctly the causes and effects of what's going on in that experience. And there's a few possible pitfalls here where even if you are very good at empathizing, you can still fail. So first of all, if you don't empathize accurately, then there's really no great opportunity to really understand how to better solve your customers' needs. Like if you don't even understand what they're feeling and why, then you're not going to come up with a better solution for them. So getting the empathy as accurate as possible is the first thing. But second, if you infer the wrong conclusions from even accurate empathy, your customers still aren't going to want what you sell them, right? If what you come up with is not really going to address the real mechanisms, even if they want it, it's not going to satisfy, because it's not addressing, it's not resolving the real uneasiness, the needs that they have. And then the third thing that we point out is that even if you get the empathy and the inference right, if you get all of that right, your customer still has to agree with you that you got it right, right? If they're inferring different causes and mechanisms to their experience, then they're still not going to want what you're selling. So even in that case, you might have to persuade them. You have to convince them that you got it right, and that what you have is actually the better solution than what they think they might want.
That sounds a bit counterintuitive. What am I doing with their experience if I persuade them that I'm right and they're not?
Yeah. So to get there, the easy response or answer to that is, let them try it. Give them a demo and a sample, and then, because again, your customers are on that value learning cycle. They're learning what to want, and so they get things wrong. As a lot of times we discover new things because entrepreneurs figured it out where we as customers, as consumers, didn't, right? And that's kind of, again, back to the Steve Jobs thing. But Steve Jobs even got this a little bit wrong. When you show it to them, a lot of times customers still don't realize that they should want it. And so they need to be persuaded by, you might be able to persuade them through clever marketing and salesmanship. If you can persuade them that it works better than what they thought they wanted, then that'll get you there. But sometimes customers they just need to see other people using it or doing it or having it, and seeing how it's making other people better off, for them to kind of realize, oh, this actually works. I don't know why, but it works, and to try it for themselves. So really, in particular, you need to persuade your lead users, if you remember that term.
Yeah.
To to try it out so that they can kind of be the guinea pigs and convince other people.
Yeah. So in fact, those consumers would be empathizing with the experience of the lead users and saying, "Oh, that sounds good. I need to have that experience."
Yeah, in a lot of things that we consume as consumers, if you think about yourself as a consumer, you do look at other consumers as exemplars for what you should want in a lot of things. In some cases, you might be the lead users. You might be the ones that are looking at the cutting edge for what you want to have and not necessarily to other people. But for a lot of things, like movies and food and stuff, you turn to other people that have tried it to get their opinion on things. And so um, that's one of the key ways that we learn what to want is by watching other consumers consume.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, Mark, this is a tool, clearly a process. We called it empathy as a process. You talk in the paper about how it's not costless, it's hard, and you got to spend time on it, and it's possible to get it wrong. And I think you've shared that with us. But tell us that it would be right to try and develop this as a process, and you and I can maybe work on a visual tool that goes into some of the details about inference and things like that. That this is something entrepreneurs can use, right? We can set this up as a tool that they can use.
Yeah, it really is a process over time, and so here's the way I think of it. And this wasn't really in the paper necessarily, but it's definitely possible as a follow-up research question. But back to that customer value learning cycle, empathy is the supply side of that same cycle. So as customers, as consumers are learning value, including yourself as a consumer learning value, the supply side of that, the entrepreneur, are empathizing with your consumers, with your customers as they learn, and so you should be empathizing all along that way, right? You shouldn't. Entrepreneurship is not some one-off investment into discovering how to facilitate value for as many customers as possible, right? If you only empathize once in the beginning, you're going to end up being displaced by competitors that are still learning from their customers, right? I mean, you say it all the time. Entrepreneurship is a journey, but it's a journey that you take with your customers. You can't leave them behind.
Yep. Yeah, and you're right. We when we visualize the value learning process, we've got a lot of detail in the actual steps of the consumer's experience, the predicted value, the relative value, the exchange value, the experience value, and so on like that. We map that out pretty well. The front end is the entrepreneur makes a value proposition, but you're saying, hey, you got to map out that front end in much more detail and make it interactive with the back end. So let's try and do that.
Absolutely.
So give us your summing up in whatever way that you would like to, Mark. I think we got the process, but also you say at the end of the paper, hey, this is exciting because there's a lot of places where we could further develop that. So touch on both of those things if you would.
Yeah, I mean, this particular model is very useful for entrepreneurs to kind of figure out how to empathize. I mean, we still need to do a lot of work into kind of unpacking how to learn how to empathize, but at least this gives us the groundwork, the framework for understanding that it can be learned. We can dig into others' experiences, and we can mentally simulate those experiences and learn from them. And so that was one of the main goals of this paper. And so there is important knowledge that you can get from your consumers. One of those things is the experiential knowledge that you can get by going to them and spending time with them, or as an alternative, picking markets and consumers that that you are familiar with, that you are culturally aligned with, because those are the consumers that you will understand best and be able to empathize best with. And they'll also be able to understand your product better. So those are things to consider. And anyway, further to your question, You mentioned the kind of the front end of the entrepreneurial journey. In entrepreneurship research, some have referred to it as a fuzzy front end, which I really like. It's a fuzzy front end because it's so blurry what's going on in this innovation process and how people come up with these ideas and decide that they're good ideas. And it's been really tough for entrepreneurship scholars to really unpack that because these are really mental and imaginative processes that are hard to study using the kind of the tools that we have in science, right? We can look at people's brains, but we can't really see what's going on inside them. Now, so empathy is really foundational in this process, right? This really brings this fuzzy front end into focus, I think. Understanding how empathy works and how we see and understand other people. That is what's going on when we understand there is an opportunity here. There is a market need. But again, yeah, like I said before, there's still lots to figure out. And so I'm working on some other work with some colleagues, including Peter Klein. And we're still unpacking these processes. But I do think the process model that we've come up with here is going to be super valuable for business practitioners, for entrepreneurs, right? For even for strategy. If you have an established business, for example, how can you improve that business? How can you connect closer and better with your consumers? For example, one possible strategic change you might consider is with your customer service team. Do you have a wide array of, cultural diversity on your team? Do you have different types of people that can connect with different types of customers? And can you, I don't know, I was just thinking about this the other day. Can you have a triage type of element in your customer service department where your customers, when they call in, get placed with customer service reps that best fit their kind of culture and background so that they can most empathize with them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's actually some progress on that in call center technology. That what's the minimum number of questions I could ask a caller to get them to the right rep, and you could inject some of this element into that.
Yeah. Getting empathy into that, I think, is going to be a nice step forward. Anyway, there's a lot of potential here, I think. So Good. We'll see where it goes.
Well, Mark, this is great. When I look at it through our economics for business lens, I can isolate the idea of simulation, which is very encouraging because we can think about what a simulation is and see if we could build one. I mean, every individual entrepreneur can do that. How can I make a good simulation? There's a process element to it. Do this first, do this second, do this third, check at this point, and so on. So that's always automatable in some sense, or visually we can create that, and we could turn it into a tool. Here's how to use this process. Here's how to apply this process. So those are all very exciting. I hope you'll help us with it.
Yep, absolutely. It's going to be fun.
Good. Well, we'll publish the paper. We'll break out your process map as it currently exists, and maybe we can ask some of our entrepreneurs for reaction to it. They can tell us how they feel about it. We'll try and empathize with them and make their experience even better.
Sounds great.
Mark, thank you very much.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.